At this point, I would love to welcome up Sandra Schulberg, producer and creator of the film. And Jordana Urman, who is here with the American Friends of Yad Vashem. And she'll be moderating tonight.
Hi. First off, can everyone hear? Is this all good? Great. Do you want to check?
Oh, yeah. How's that?
Great. Thank you. I think we're all good. So first off, I want to thank you for this film. And thank you for letting us all be here to watch it along with you. I'm sure it has a personal impact as well as, a general impact. I want to take us back to the beginning of the film because I think there's so much to talk about towards the end and everything that we've seen. But bringing us back to the beginning, the film opens with letters from your father to your mother. And he talks about the importance of the work he was doing. And towards the end of the film, you mentioned that growing up, you didn't know all that much about his efforts. Can you talk to us about that? He didn't share it all that much? You didn't know what he had done?
No, it's, I think children can be very egotistical, and you tend to focus on, in our family at least, we were very involved with my father's work as we were growing up, but it was the work that he was doing then. And by the way, I'm very thrilled that Arthur White and Sue Drury are here, people who worked very closely with my father. Thank you so much for being here. So we knew a lot about what he was doing as we were growing up, but it's true. I don't remember his ever talking to me about what he did in the few years just before I was born. I was actually conceived in Berlin during the Berlin blockade while he was doing this work. After he made the official film about the trial, Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, he was asked to stay on in Berlin as the head of the documentary film unit of military government. And he made, in that capacity, a number of what were called denazification, re-education films. And so he was working very directly with this concept of, how do you educate people to embrace democracy again? And then went on to be recruited to run the film program of the Marshall Plan. So we moved to Paris a couple of months before I was born. But it turns out that he did show this film to my youngest brother's class in 7th grade. So the film was not entirely ever gone from his mind. And also amongst all those papers you saw in the boxes, I found a letter that he wrote in 1960 to the editor of the New York Times. And he specifically references the fact that there's been a resurgence of anti-Semitism and of nationalism, in Germany and in other parts of the world. And he says, this is a time when this film might be useful. Now, he knew that the film had been suppressed. He knew that it had not been shown in America, thanks to Kenneth Royal. And so this was his plea, really, to the New York Times to recognize that this film had been made and it was possibly an important film. But fortunately, my father left, as you saw, he left hundreds of pages of letters that he wrote. He and my mother were very much in love because they had just been married shortly before he was sent to Germany. And he wrote to her almost daily, not by hand with a quill pen. My only beef with Jean-Christophe, and I wasn't able to be in France during the edit because of COVID. My father typed all of his letters. The only time we found letters that he handwrote, or not even letters, but notes, was when he was, in the field and perhaps didn't have his typewriter with him. But I have forgiven Jean-Christophe for this. So he was writing typing voluminous letters home to Barbara, my mother, 10, 16-page letters. I mean, he must have been up so late each night writing these letters. So we have this extraordinary trove of letters, and they're very eloquently reported, and they're also very emotional in some of the letters. And he really tries to make her feel that she's there and with him and close to the action. So even though I never got to talk to my father about his work, I feel as though his words, his voice spoke to me and continues to speak to me through these letters.
I think that that's a lovely sentiment, and lucky also to have that with
Very
you.
lucky.
But you mentioned that your father, when he saw an uptick in anti-Semitism, wrote to the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
Did the uptick in anti-Semitism recently have anything to do with you wanting to create this film and pushing it forward?
Not, specifically. I mean, I think all of us are aware that anti-Semitism never really goes away. If you're a Jew, it's part of your consciousness. What I thought was important, and I must say it had not occurred to me to make this film, although after I restored my father's film about the trial, there were many people who said, oh, you should make a film about this, or you should make a feature film, and I really didn't want to do that. I've been a professional filmmaker my whole career, and I know about the compromises that you make when you're making fiction or nonfiction. And I really felt this story was way too complex to reduce to the length of a film. I was focused with my uncle on writing a book about it called The Celluloid Noose, which he and I didn't get to complete before his death, but which I do intend to finish writing. But when Jean-Christophe came to me and asked if he could make this film based on this much shorter booklet I'd written called Filmmakers for the Prosecution, I decided that he was trustworthy. I mean, Jean-Christophe's grandfather was a doctor who survived Auschwitz. He's mentioned in Primo Levi's first book. They were in the Auschwitz clinic together. His father had been arrested by the Gestapo at a very young age. Jean-Christophe's father, George Klutz, was an editor whom my father worked with very closely, gave him his first job in film at the Marshall Plan, and brought his father, George, to America to work with him and Arthur on many films that they did for NBC and so on. And I just felt, and then Jean-Christophe had grown up to become a very respected French TV journalist who had made several films about Rwanda. He was actually shot covering the Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda. So I also knew that he understood the issues underlying the Nuremberg trial and the films about the trial, the films presented at the trial. He understood a great deal about the importance of visual evidence, which we take for granted now, but was such a new concept at the time of the first Nuremberg trial. So I decided to say yes, and even though this 60-minute version of the film leaves out a tremendous amount and cuts all kinds of corners, I still am very grateful that we were able to make this film, because it does give you, it does take you behind the scenes. And the one thing I will say, it probably gives you the misimpression that the Nuremberg trial hinged on the visual evidence, which it did not. There were reams and reams and reams of documents, generally the Nazis' own documents, that were used to condemn them. But the fact is that because of the power of the visual evidence, that is what people come away with. And I thought it was important, and that's part of what we tried to do with this film. I think it's important that people understand where those images came from, how they're used, how they're misused, and just to try to get you to start thinking about those images that otherwise people maybe just tend to consume without understanding how they were shot and gathered in the first place.
You know, it's interesting that you say you think people just see the content and consume it, because something I was thinking about as we were all watching this footage was the audible gasps that you could hear as you were seeing certain images. And for me, as the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, I'm someone who often falls down this rabbit hole of looking at content and consuming this content, even though I shouldn't. But I think that everyone has such a different reaction to it, because I would think for you, to a certain degree, there's an element of pride that your father found this footage, put this footage out into the world, whereas for some people in the audience, I think it's graphic and I think it's upsetting. And I find for myself, while it's graphic and upsetting, I really am looking at the faces of everyone in every shot, trying to pinpoint, can I find my family? And it's something that I think every time I look at this footage. So as I watch this, and admittedly I had a pre-screen of this, I found myself still watching again more carefully at the different faces I may have missed the first time.
Right.
And the reason I raise that is you must feel some positivity knowing how much this footage means to people.
Well, you know, I'm very much like you in the sense that, you know, when I was restoring Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, which includes, you know, unfortunately, well, you can't really say unfortunately, it includes as much atrocity footage as, you know, my father felt had to be included in order for you to understand, including non-Jews, what had led to the Nuremberg trial. But like you, I find myself looking, and it's so touching. You know, you can't help but look at every single face. And I feel with some of these faces that I know them and I recognize them because I've seen them over and over and over again. And I know, I heard many of you gasp, and I know how horrifying it is to look at these images. But you know, on the other hand, there are people who don't believe, who actually still don't believe that, you know, these kinds of, this inhumanity to our fellow humans took place, that these kinds of atrocities were perpetrated. And so I do think it is important to show some amount of this footage. Yeah.
Brings me to my next question. One of the things that I found most interesting about the film, it's a weird word to use, but is the arc of Rudolf Hess and his, you know, feigned amnesia to seeing one film and saying, oh, I'm back, I remember everything and I did it all. And I found that to be remarkable. Yeah. And I know you obviously have seen the film more times, you've worked on it more times. Do you think that there was any, obviously the film was the turning point, but what do you think it was about seeing the footage, about being there in that room, seeing the film, that all of a sudden made him decide, I'm going to give up this tactic and just give in?
Well, you know, that is such a fascinating turning point because of the letter, you know, that was, I think, the letter of November 9th that my father wrote to my mom, in which he describes, as you heard a tiny bit, he describes bringing Hess down into the screening room and showing him, you know, they were convinced that seeing himself on screen, that he would give himself away, and he didn't, as you heard. So, you know, but now the fact that he was in the courtroom and the gravity of the courtroom, I mean, I can't pretend that I am able to be inside of his head, but that obviously changed his perception. Now, I also think it's important for, for those of you who don't know that, he got off relatively lightly with a 20-year sentence because he had actually flown out of Germany in 41, early on, and crashed a plane in the UK, supposedly intending to try to negotiate some kind of peace. So he was actually not, he was imprisoned, and he spent the rest of the war in a British prison. So he was not able to be as mercenary, as criminal, as cruel as many of his fellow Nazis who were prosecuted either at the first trial or there were 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials. I think that's also important for those of you who don't know. The first trial was the only international trial, but the Americans decided to hold 12 more trials in the same courtroom. And one of those was the trial of the Einsatzgruppen, which Ben Ferencz prosecuted, which was, is called the greatest mass murder trial in history because he documented over 1 million people. There were many, many more, but he had the documentary evidence to prove that at least 1 million people had been murdered by the SS. And Ben just turned 103 last week, by the way. He is extraordinary, and I asked him, how did you choose 24 people to indict? And he said, I could have put 3,000 people in the dock. He said, but the Nuremberg courtroom only had, as you could see, 2 benches on either side, and you couldn't seat more than 24 people in the dock. So every one of the Nuremberg trials indicted only 24 people. And in the case of the first trial, only 21 people sat in the dock for the reasons you heard. So he always said, it was just a tiny sliver that we could prosecute. But he said it was so important for us to establish the principle that people would be held personally accountable. And I think that's what we all have to keep in mind about the Nuremberg trials, that it was symbolically extremely important, it was juridically extremely important, and finally it was incredibly important because of the documentation that it produced, which is still relied on by jurists and historians and people who are instrumental in the attempt to prevent these kinds of crimes from continuing to happen, which they still do. Crimes against humanity and genocide, unfortunately, despite the ambitions of Justice Jackson and his fellow prosecutors at Nuremberg, unfortunately, they continue to happen. So the Nuremberg trial and everything that it produced this is really a tremendously important legacy. And I think, partly because my father's film never was released. After the trial, there was a flurry, an article in Life magazine, pictures of the defendants, especially those who were hanged, pictures of the 3 who were acquitted. But it passed relatively quickly. And Americans really did not, I don't think they really came to grips with the lessons of Nuremberg, if you will. And most survivors also didn't want to talk about this. I'm sure many of you know this from your own experience. So it was really only with the advent of television and the trial of Adolf Eichmann that people began to learn really about what had happened during World War II. And people began to grapple with this concept of what does it mean to hold someone accountable in a court of law for these kinds of crimes. So that combination, it was also the same year that you had Judgment at Nuremberg, which is not about this trial, it's about the trial of the Nazi judges. But that film also had an impact, I think, in the popular culture. And it's from that time that the word Holocaust becomes a modern term, a modern concept, as the English language translation of the Shoah. So a lot of things happened in 1960, 1961 that brought about a new level of consciousness, and that allowed also people to start, who had survived the concentration camps and the death camps, to start talking about it.
So I'm cognizant of time. I'm going to open the floor up if there's anyone that has a question. I see you, sir. Yes.
Hi. Please give me your name also when you.
My name is Nathan Hershkowitz.
Thank you.
I have what to talk about. Thank you. My name is Nathan Hershkowitz. I'm from a survivor home myself. I just want to get the dates first clarified. The trial began on which date? October 1st of...
No, the trial began actually because of a deal with the Russians who wanted to get credit for hosting the trial. The indictments were read actually on November 20 in Berlin.
Of what year? Of 1945.
And the actual trial started in Nuremberg on November 21. And the verdicts were rendered on October 1, 1946.
That's very significant. I actually watched a YouTube review, a YouTube recording of an interview that you gave to Eric Goldstein. I watched it this afternoon
The
as
Jewish
I was
Broadcasting Service.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I looked at the Jewish calendar. October 1st, 1946 was smack in the middle of the Jewish Days of Judgment, the high holidays. It was Tuesday, the 6th of Tishrei. I did not know that. What I did know is that October 16th, 1946 was a Wednesday, the day of the execution of the 10 remaining convicted Nazi leaders. And that day in the Jewish calendar is Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah is the culmination of the high holidays. You know, it's Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then there's Hoshana Rabbah, when in Jewish tradition the angels are given the notes to begin to carry out the judgments. And for dozens of centuries, we never knew about a code that exists in the book of Esther about the 10 sons of Haman being hung. And there's actually a code about the letters that signify, we understood afterwards, that signify the Jewish year of 5707. My understanding from what you've taught me today is that the trial had to formally begin only after the beginning of that Jewish year. The year of 5707 began that week of October 1st. And Goering killed himself the night before, so that there were only 10 of the Nazis representing the 10 evil sons of Haman who were hung that very same day.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, question: was the John Ford Soviet expert, was he Jewish? Did your father ever? Does anybody know?
Was
I'm just curious.
Avenarius Jewish? That is a very good question. I'll have to find the answer to that. Thank you.
Okay, I see a few more questions in the crowd. I'm just going to see where she has the mic. There we go.
Charles Mutter Pearl. It would seem to me that with the indictment of Putin for crimes against humanity, that this documentary could be a wonderful blueprint for the prosecution in absentia.
Well, you know, this is an extraordinary moment in the history of international criminal justice, because it is because of the ICC's indictment of Putin, and it also gives rise to an extraordinary irony, because the four major countries who are not parties to the ICC are Russia, the United States, China, and Israel. Four countries that do not want to have to be subject to the jurisdiction of the ICC. Now, I work quite closely with Eli Rosenbaum, whom you saw in the film, who was named by Merrick Garland to be our counselor for war crimes accountability, with a specific, mandate to investigate the crimes being committed in Ukraine. And, it does take a certain amount of chutzpah on the part of the U.S. To be trying to take the lead when we ourselves don't want to be subject to the very same principles that we helped to establish at Nuremberg. So this has been painful to many of us who've been working with these issues. I was at the we showed Nuremberg at the conference in Kampala in 2010, which was the first anniversary conference of the Assembly of States Parties of the ICC, and the U.S. delegation, which was invited as a observer group, was behind the scenes arguing vociferously, lobbying actively to defeat the amendment to the Rome Statute that would have made, and did ultimately make, despite the Americans, the crime of aggression a crime prosecutable by the ICC under the Rome Statute. So this is a big concern. And although under Clinton, our first ambassador for war crimes, David Sheffer, did sign the Rome Treaty, but it was never ratified by the U.S. Senate. So, and then Bush tore up the Rome Treaty, supposedly, that with Sheffer's signature on it. So it's become a bit of a dead letter in the United States. I am glad that the ICC has taken this big step of indicting Putin, because it's such a clear case of the crime of aggression. And I think it's important that people understand what the crime of aggression is. The crime of aggression was actually the crime that Jackson personally cared most about at Nuremberg, and personally was involved in prosecuting the conspiracy to commit the crime of aggression, which was count 1. It required, they had very little basis for this, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. They really tried to create a new basis under law for prosecuting the crime of aggression at Nuremberg. But it's a very difficult issue for sovereign countries around the world that traditionally used war making as an instrument of its own national and foreign policy, as we're seeing writ large in Ukraine. So I'm sorry for that long-winded answer, but this is something I really care about.
I think we can fit one more question in.
What I still find astonishing is that no social scientist, no psychiatrist has even attempted, other than the history of Germany's Sonderweg, the special history of not becoming unified until very late, compared to other European countries. Nobody has even attempted to explain the barbarism that took place. It's astonishing to me. That stands out, that no one has even attempted to do it.
It's very hard to explain. When I showed the Arabic language version of Nuremberg to a small group of Bahraini judges, prosecutors, and high-ranking police officers. There were 4 women in the group. One was a family court judge, Judge Nura, and the day after we showed the film, she came up to me and she said, I must talk to you about the film. I'm very disturbed by it. And I was delighted, and we made a date for later that day, and I pulled out my camera, and she said, no, you can't film me. But she said, I can't get the film out of my mind. I'm so terribly disturbed by it. And I thought she was going to talk to me about the atrocity images that she had seen in the film. But she didn't. She said, until I saw your father's film, I saw Hitler as a great leader of his people. But now I understand how wrong I was. And it really brought home to me this, it gave me another insight into anti-Semitism, because I also showed the film in Tehran, in Iran, and we made a Farsi language version. And you really begin to understand when you meet with people who are either Arabs or in the case Iranians, but people who are being propagandized by their own governments about whether the Holocaust took place. You begin to understand that it is less about what really happened than about a way to attain and hold power. And as soon as you show them what really happened, they're just as convinced as we are. In Tehran, when I showed the film, this deputy director of the Human Rights Center came up to me afterwards and said, everyone who was in the room last night and heard you talk about how your father made this film, and said everyone in the room believed you and believed the images that we saw on film. But he said, you should know that the rumors are already circulating today that it's all American propaganda by people who were not in the room. And of course, ironically, you don't see that here, but if you see Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, it does tell you that right up front that the film is made by the US government. So it's very easy to also understand that in a way, it is a film of propaganda. It is a film that it's trying to be a propaganda for the rule of law, but it is a film that has a message. And so you get into this very fascinating landscape in which is all about public messaging and public diplomacy, and how images are used, as we said in this film, how images become part of the battlefield, and how images are used, how stories are told, and how they're also capable of misrepresentation. I don't mean to diminish the significance. I think the question you're asking is, none of us can really understand this to this day. I mean, is there an explanation for this? I don't mean to diminish it by any means. I was just trying to give you another kind of insight. That's all.
I think just
I think you need to realize that every human is born not knowing the history of what came before. And Holocaust denial, all of this depends on memory. You have to be taught. You have to know. And, I mean, that's one of the tragedies now, that the very last living survivors who lived through this are, 100 years old already. I mean, this is what we have to do
So I know it's time for us to wrap up, but I think what we can all agree on is there are some things that we won't have the answers to.
Yeah.
There are some things we just will never know and never understand. So thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you again, both of you, for
you.
sharing your time and your talent with us. Again, please check it out. We have Shtetl screening next week. We would love you to join us, and have a great night.
And I do want to just say that